My name is Laura Kapp. I live in Ashland, and I have had the honor of chairing the organizational committee for this event, and I serve as a member of the board of the Humanities in Nebraska as well. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to the 2021 Chautauqua. Thank you so much for joining us for the 50s in Focus, presented by Humanities Nebraska and our community partners here in Ashland. We've been planning this for a really long time, as you can imagine, because the planning started before COVID. So this has been about a year and a half in the making. Many people have helped to bring the 50s in Focus Chautauqua to Ashland, and many thanks are in order. The 50s in Focus Chautauqua is presented by Humanities Nebraska with support from the Johnny Carson Fund at the Nebraska Cultural Endowment, the State of Nebraska, the City of Ashland, the Ashland Public Library, the Ashland Chamber of Commerce, Farmers and Merchants Bank of Ashland, I3 Bank. A very big thanks to Helen Rakes, who is in the crowd with us tonight, and to Chuck and Shirley Niemeyer. I saw Shirley earlier. In his name foundation, the Ashland RV Campground, who is donating a spot to us for the evening so we can plug in. The Ashland Historical Society, the Ashland Area Economic Development Corporation, Lutton Law Office, the National Title Company, Karen Stilley, the Glacial Till Tasting Room, the Roost, Strategic Air and Space Museum, My Shop Postscript, and then the contributions of many other generous businesses, organizations, and individuals. Please let's give them all a round of applause. We're so grateful. Also, please welcome Chris Sumrick, who is the Executive Director of Humanities Nebraska. Chris, are you, did he just step out? A huge thank you to Christy Hyatt Carley, who is the engine behind Chautauqua at the Humanities Nebraska staff, who is over here running camera. I want to thank Mary Yeager, Heather Thomas back there, Joanna Hale, Liz Mikowski, Barbara Grant, and Sherry Lynn Hansen, all from the HN staff. Thanks go to Kyle Cartwright from the Nebraska Cultural Endowment and Amy Haddad, who is a board member for the NCE. And then we have several Humanities Nebraska board members in attendance as well. So I'd like to recognize Keith Bystrom. Please stand up and wave. Thank you. Lynette Krieger. Thank you. Tammy Hellman. Thank you, Tammy. Amy Sandine, I just saw arrive in the back. Thank you. And Graciela Carnero Livingston. Thank you. Just one more note before I introduce our moderator for the evening. There was a phone lost in this parking lot up here. It's a Samsung Note 10 in a black case. Did anybody in the audience happen to find a phone in that parking lot? Okay, if you did or if you hear of it, I have a phone number that you can call to get back in touch with the person who lost their phone. It is not the phone number of the phone. So come see me if you hear of that. Please take a moment, speaking of phones, to put your own on silent. And please note that the Chautauqua tent is a smoke-free environment, and flash photography is not allowed. Restroom facilities are located over to your right of the tent. And at this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Danielle Battisti, who will be introducing our keynote speaker and moderating our Q&A later this evening. Dr. Battisti is an associate professor of history at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, where she specializes in immigration and ethnic history. Her book, Whom We Shall Welcome, Italian Americans and Immigration Reform, examines both the liberal and conservative elements of Italian American efforts to influence American immigration policies in the 1950s and 1960s. It was awarded the Immigration and Ethnic History Society's Best First Book Award for 2019. She will also be presenting 2 programs for the Chautauqua at the Ashland Public Library tomorrow afternoon. Please welcome Dr. Danielle Battisti.
I think this is on? Yeah, okay. First of all, thank you so much, Laura. I'm very pleased to be back here again. I was here in 2019 and I had a great time at the Chautauqua, and I'm very pleased to represent UNO's History Department. I've been teaching there since 2012. I teach 20th century U.S. history courses, obviously immigration history. I often teach on the Cold War and U.S. foreign relations. I'm also the graduate program chair, so if you have any students interested in history, you can certainly send them my way. It is my distinct pleasure, though, to introduce our keynote speaker tonight. Jim Newton is a veteran journalist, an author, and a teacher. In 25 years at the Los Angeles Times, Newton has worked as a reporter, an editor, bureau chief, columnist, and from 2007 to 2010, the editor of the editorial pages. He's the recipient of a number of national and local awards in journalism and participated in 2 staff efforts, coverage of the 1992 riots and the 1994 Northridge earthquakes, both of which were awarded the Pulitzer Prize. Before coming to the Times, Newton was a reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and began his career as the 1985 to 1986 clerk to the New York Times columnist James Reston. He's also a graduate of Dartmouth College. He moved to UCLA for full-time to teach in the School of Communications and Public Policy and to found Blueprint, a new UCLA magazine, blueprint.ucla.edu if you want to check it out, which addresses the policy changes facing California and Los Angeles in particular. He serves as the magazine's editor-in-chief. Also, if this wasn't enough to impress you already, he is the respected author of 4 major works of history: Justice for All, Earl Warren and the Nation He Made; Eisenhower, The White House Years, Worthy Fights, a memoir of leadership in War and Peace, which is a collaboration with former CIA Director and National Security of Defense Leon Panetta; and Man of Tomorrow, The Relentless Life of Jerry Brown, which was released just recently in May 2020. Please help me in welcoming Jim Newton tonight.
Good evening. I just want to start off by welcoming all of you, thanking you for being here. It's a thrill to be among people again, to be something especially nice about being under a tent as we all recover from COVID-19 and return to the roots of Chautauqua. I'm honored and more than a little bit relieved to be able to be here with you. I also just want to say, before getting going, a special thanks to Humanities Nebraska, all of whom have been so instrumental in putting this together, and I'm so appreciative. Also, my hosts over at the Roost, which is lovely, and all you people here in Ashland who have given me just a lovely day getting acquainted with your town, so thank you. I'd like to talk this evening about President Eisenhower and his achievements and some of his defects, or some of the defects of his administration during his 8 years as President of the United States from 1953 to 1961. As I do, I'd like to emphasize a particular aspect of his leadership that I think is of particular consequence and relevance today. I don't need to tell any of you that we live in a time of great division and that the center often seems elusive these these days to the point of really being non-existent. That's an animating fact, maybe the animating fact of our contemporary politics. And it's so deep that it's begun to bend our expectations of government and politics. We no longer even hope for certain things. Healthcare coverage for every American, a transportation network that allows people to move easily about the country, the elimination of poverty. Those are things that were once debated in this country and thought of as achievable. Now they seem largely out of reach, and we've put them out of our minds in part because they would demand so much compromise in order to get there. And compromise itself has become something that seems impossible from officials who are so dedicated to what they believe is principle that they can't give ground or imagine that they can't give ground. Eisenhower believed differently, and that's, I think, part of the reason to reflect on his time in office. He did not see what he called the middle way as an abdication of principle. He did not believe that it would ruin him in the eyes of conservatives if he negotiated with the Soviet Union or worked with the United Nations. He believed very much in restrained and limited government, but that didn't stop him from proposing and bringing to fruition the interstate highway system, which was the largest public works project in American history up to that point in time. He didn't love higher taxes. I mean, nobody really loves higher taxes. But he presided over a highly progressive income tax, federal income tax. I'll come back to that in just a minute. He did not, in short, believe that his responsibility or his allegiance to his party exceeded his responsibility to the country. He did believe firmly that officials, elected or appointed, had a responsibility to improve the lives of Americans, even if the particular improvement at issue was not the reform of choice that he would necessarily have supported. So he vigorously pursued that idea, this idea of a middle way, of a way forward, across a range of fields. Not always successfully, and I'll talk some more about that in a minute too. But tonight I'd like to focus on three of those in particular, just to identify a few. His management of the economy, his record on civil rights, and his diplomatic and military initiatives as part of the Cold War. Oops. I hope that's not my remarks. Sorry, give me a sec. Sorry about that. I think these might be yours. But here, let me stash those. Okay. In the three areas, sorry, last being military and diplomatic initiatives as part of the Cold War. So in each of those, Eisenhower worked, sometimes successfully and sometimes less so, to find a new way. Not always a middle course, but a new course that often represented a new option that he believed would offer a way forward for Americans through these issues. As I talk about these, and certainly as we take questions at the end of this, I hope that we can reflect on ways in which these illustrate our challenges in the moment, too. One of the reasons to study history, obviously, is to glean lessons from it, and I hope we can do some of that in each of these. Before I do all that, though, I want to say just a few words about who Eisenhower was. I think it does help to understand where he came from, to understand why this middle way was so appealing to him. So first things first, he was born in Denison, Texas, in a thunderstorm, he liked to say, and he was raised in Abilene, Kansas. He was the third of six brothers. Arthur and Edgar were older. Roy, Earl, and Milton were younger. There was yet another brother, Paul. He was the fifth of the Eisenhower boys to be born, but he died when he was 10 months old of diphtheria. They grew up in an exceedingly modest home. It still stands in Abilene. You can visit it. It's a little over 800 square feet. That's actually smaller than the office that Eisenhower had in the Pentagon. And so it was a crowded place for six boys. As he grew up, he was not just physically kind of in the middle of this pack of six boys, but as he grew older, he was ideologically at their center as well. His older brother, Edgar, was very conservative, sometimes very cranky, would write these very cross letters to Eisenhower as president about this policy or another. His youngest brother, the youngest of all the Eisenhower brothers, Milton, was a very intellectual liberal. He went on to become president of Johns Hopkins University. So Eisenhower would often, first as a child, and then as a young adult, and then finally as president, find himself kind of pulled between the poles of his brothers, all of whom were quite outspoken too. As you, I'm sure, are aware, Eisenhower attended West Point. He attended West Point mainly because it was free. It was an opportunity for him to get a free education, and yet it led to his very storied career in the United States Army. That too, his upbringing in the Army, I think, reinforced a kind of natural centrism for Eisenhower. The military is the most important of all apolitical American institutions, and Eisenhower practiced nonpartisan problem solving at the highest and most urgent levels long before politics ever occurred to him. There's not a Republican way to advance an army or a Democratic way to supply an army. There are urgent crises that face leaders, but partisan politics is really not part of the analysis for the military. Eisenhower absorbed those lessons throughout his young adulthood. He was receptive to guidance from mentors. I'll talk about a couple here in just a sec, and learned a lot from experience. And the result was that he emerged from his military time uncomfortable amid tension, ideological tension. He was very wary of extremism and self-aggrandizement. All of those are lessons of his upbringing and his military time. He was a great admirer of George Marshall, who you're familiar with, I'm sure, the famously apolitical chief of staff during World War II. Eisenhower also respected FDR, but interacted with him only on matters of war. Not once was he asked his opinions about the president's domestic or political agendas. By contrast, he was really quite disgusted by the antics of Douglas MacArthur, with whom he had served early in his career. I used to refer to his time with MacArthur as a study in theatrics. MacArthur, returning the favor, referred to Ike as the best clerk I ever had. During World War II, when Ike held the vaunted title of Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in Europe, he navigated between such difficult and tempestuous personalities as Churchill, Montgomery, de Gaulle, Patton, the other leaders of the conflict in Europe. It required a calm and measured leader to bring those personalities and interests into line. One of my favorite stories from that period, there's a moment where Montgomery was with Eisenhower and he was railing about a setback, a battlefield setback, and about the poor leadership that was exhibited, implicitly, of course, meaning Eisenhower. And in the middle of it, Eisenhower reaches over, puts his hand on Montgomery's knee and says, "Steady, Monty, you can't talk to me like that. I'm your boss." That's a good lesson in political leadership. What all that meant is that after he had secured the victory in Europe in World War II, Eisenhower was exceptionally well prepared for the presidency temperamentally and through his contacts. He knew really all the leaders in Europe. At the same time, he was also curiously undeveloped politically in conventional political terms. He didn't have MacArthur's obsessive need to control, but nor was he entirely in accord with Marshall's utter aloofness from political controversy. Despite the leadership that Eisenhower had shown and the renown that had come his way, he had never battled his way through a domestic political controversy. He pressed the Allied invasion of Europe without any really meaningful contact with Congress or the courts, or even the staff of the White House. His relationships were almost entirely through Marshall. It was, in fact, famously unclear at the end of the war whether he was a Republican or a Democrat. Harry Truman, a Democrat, of course, offered to step aside in 1948 if Eisenhower would run as a Democrat. Eisenhower was flattered by the offer, also a little bit mystified by it, and obviously demurred in 1948, though not for very long. Privately, though, of course, Eisenhower did have views, and they were fundamentally conservative on what we would describe as conservative on the spectrum that we're used to today. He was suspicious of a government that worked, that intruded on what he saw as prerogatives of personal liberty and family life. He liked to make fun of a New Deal pamphlet that taught people how to wash their dishes, which he saw as just kind of evidence of a government that was inclined to coddle people inappropriately in his view. He believed in the central place of family and in the farm values of places like Abilene, where he grew up. He was not deeply religious. He grew up a Mennonite, which is a pacifist group organization. Interestingly, his mother, in fact, cried the day he left for West Point. She was so shocked at the idea of him going to the military. But he was really more comfortable with business leaders than he was with religious figures. He trusted science. He believed in human progress. He was, in all of those respects, a fairly conventional, centrist, business-oriented mid-20th century American conservative, albeit one who had the most impressive military resume on the planet. It does, if you are thinking about a career in politics, it helps to have defeated Adolf Hitler. So he had a good leg up in that respect. After some hesitation in leading up to the 1952 race, Eisenhower did join the Republican primary campaign in 52. He quickly surpassed all his Republican rivals, including Earl Warren, who we'll talk about today a little bit and tomorrow in more depth. And then he easily beat Adlai Stevenson, the Democratic nominee. He walloped him. Eisenhower carried all but 9 states in that election. Only the Deep South, which was still then solidly Democratic, voted for Stevenson, and really more out of habit than out of any ideological allegiance with Stevenson. And even there, Eisenhower peeled off some Southern support, surprising for a Republican in that era. Eisenhower won Virginia, Florida, Tennessee, and Texas, among other states. His coattails were long and powerful. He ushered in Republican majorities in both the House and Senate, and which meant that when Eisenhower took the presidency in 1953, Republicans were in control of the government. And yet, Eisenhower proved soon that he was determined to govern as a pragmatist, not as an ideologue or as a representative, really, of his party. That was most apparent, I would argue, in his when you look at his management of the economy, and that's where I really want to start the substance of tonight. Eisenhower favored government measures to gently to stimulate growth, and he consistently fended off more conservative voices who wanted him to cut taxes. The economy fell into a mild recession soon after Eisenhower was elected or became president, and he agreed to eliminate some excise taxes as a part of a program of economic stimulus. But again, he rejected calls from those who wanted him to cut federal income tax rates. That set the standard for his presidency. Eisenhower never proposed lowering federal income tax rates during his 8 years as president, despite the obvious benefits it would have had for him politically and for the Republican Party. He didn't do so in the first 2 years when he almost certainly could have gotten it through because he had both houses of Congress with him. And he also didn't argue for it later when it would have served him politically, even if he would have had a more difficult time getting rates lowered. He certainly could have advocated them and won political points doing it. It's worth, by the way, pausing on that. It is the easiest thing on earth for a politician to call for lowering taxes. It's pandering of the most basic variety. I've worked in the news business all my life, and I've seen that happen a million times. It allows a politician who argues for a tax rate to boost his own ratings and then rely on other people who disagree with it economically to take the fall. So it's a very tempting thing for political figures to do. Many of them do it. Eisenhower did not and would not. And taxes, just to be clear, are hardly beyond debate in this period. Just again, to talk about this in a modern context, the current debate over the federal income tax has a lot of nuance, but the most salient point in it generally is to argue around the top marginal tax rate. Today, the top marginal federal tax rate is 37%. That's for income of over $518,000, annual income of over $518,000 for a single filer for a head of household. Some people argue that rate is so high that it discourages wealthy people from working and that it otherwise stifles investments and growth. So 37% today is the point of conflict. In Eisenhower's era, that rate would have been laughably low. The marginal tax rate on people making $400,000 a year or more throughout the 1950s was 91%. So we're in a whole different universe of this debate now. And he didn't argue for lowering it from 91%, never mind 37%. Now granted, $400,000 is a lot of money in 1960 when Eisenhower left office. It's about the equivalent of $1.5 million today. But that 91% top marginal tax rate sat atop a highly progressive tax code, the top rates of which would be really considered confiscatory in today's Washington. Corporate taxes also were similarly high by historical and modern standards. The effective corporate tax rates in the 1950s were between 35 and 48%, depending on how you do the math. That's compared to about 15% today. And yet, just as a reminder, in the 1950s, people worked, businesses grew, and none of that is because Eisenhower was in any way a liberal. It is just evidence that he was more committed to progress than to the projection of his ideological convictions. A couple other words on the economy. He was quite refreshingly uninhibited by economic orthodoxy in other parts of his management of the economy, too. Although he was the first Republican to hold the presidency in 20 years when he came to office in '53, he left intact the New Deal programs that his party had been arguing to roll back since the beginning of FDR's time in office. Many Republicans, for instance, wanted to roll back Social Security or abolish it altogether. They had itched to do that during the FDR and Truman presidencies. Eisenhower refused to do so. In fact, he expanded Social Security eligibility and benefits. And he famously made investments in government investments that employed thousands of Americans. Again, most notably, as I referred to a moment ago, the interstate highway system, which was the largest public works project of its in American history up to that point. The highway system didn't pay for itself. It was financed by a new highway users fee, which included hikes in gas and oil taxes, both of which the administration proposed and Eisenhower signed. In all of that, I would argue that the Eisenhower presidency stands as a model of moderate economic management, balanced budgets, investment in infrastructure, and refusal to slash programs or taxes for mere political advantage. Those are all, I would argue, commitments that are worth considering when we think about Washington today. Moving to foreign policy, the middle way with this kind of deliberate attempt to position the administration between poles found a different expression in foreign policy. Perhaps the best place to start that is by just stating concretely what the objectives of the Eisenhower presidency were in terms of foreign policy. And they really boil down to two. They were to contain or roll back Soviet and Chinese communism, and it was to preserve the peace. That's easy to state those goals. It's important to realize, though, to some degree, those goals are in tension with one another. Rolling back Soviet communism, for instance, might have been achieved by going to war with the Soviet Union, clearly at the expense of preserving the peace. Peace might have been achieved by acquiescing to Soviet or Chinese adventurism, but that would have been to sacrifice on the goal of containing or rolling back communism. And just not to put too fine a point on it, but Eisenhower had just been to war in Europe with a leader who had taken advantage of early acquiescence, and Eisenhower had long before the presidency been disabused of the notion that you can satisfy an ambitious enemy by giving up small pieces of territory. He was determined, Eisenhower that is, was determined to protect American lives in the present and American interests in the long term. So he embarked on this program, simply stated, but complicated and to some degree at tension with itself. As with the economy, he was pulled between poles. There were loud voices on both sides of this argument. Some Americans believed the United States should appeal to the Soviets, for instance, the Soviet reason, and find some kind of common course with what was then the world's only other superpower. Others, some of whom were in his own administration, argued for nothing less than the preemptive destruction of the Soviet Union and its 200 million or so inhabitants. Still others lobbied for a similar war with China. Douglas MacArthur, Ike's old kind of anti-mentor, proposed in a memo during the period after Ike was elected and before he became president. He suggested over and over that he had a secret plan for ending the Korean War. Eisenhower asked him what it was. He sent Ike a memo. The plan essentially boiled down to launching nuclear attacks on every Chinese airfield that was within flying distance of South Korea, and then sowing nuclear waste along the border between China and Korea. It's hard to imagine what could have gone wrong there, but Eisenhower rejected it out of hand. But it's important to note that because MacArthur was not someone that Eisenhower took terribly seriously, but he was a very serious person in the American foreign and military establishment. So this wasn't a kook, or at least not obviously a kook. So that idea, that notion of really waging this war to resolve this conflict was one that Eisenhower had to debate and consider. Throughout his presidency, the Joint Chiefs laid plans for launching a nuclear war against the Soviet Union while preparing the United States for the almost certain counterstrike that would result. The National Security Council considered changes in strategy that were intended to make deterrence more credible by making war more likely. And I'll talk about that in just a sec. Eisenhower rejected all of that. His defense of the United States and its allies and interests through the 8 years of his presidency rested on a refusal to resort to nuclear war, even while threatening to wage a nuclear war at any moment. He grounded his policies in bedrock belief in American values and institutions, and in his reliance on America's web of treaties and alliances to underscore the unity of the West based on shared principles of human and political rights. He recognized that America's defense of Europe depended on the threat of nuclear retaliation, and he kept the Soviet Union relentlessly apprised of his willingness to pull the trigger. At the same time, though, he was clear-eyed about what such a war would mean. He was briefed at one point, this is from my book and others have cited it as well, he was briefed at one point by officials from the Treasury Department on what would be required to rebuild the dollar in the wake of a nuclear war. The briefing was going on for a bit, and Eisenhower at one point finally just interrupts and kind of gruffly, and he says, "Wait a minute, boys, we're not going to be reconstructing the dollar, we're going to be grubbing for worms." Eisenhower, more than any president, with the possible exception of Grant, understood the real consequences of war, and Eisenhower alone grasped the significance of what that would mean in a nuclear context. His ability to keep up the facade of a willingness to fight a nuclear war while resolutely refusing to do so was his greatest military triumph. My friend Evan Thomas has a really good book about this aspect of the Eisenhower presidency. It's appropriately entitled Ike's Bluff. It held for the crucible years of the 1950s, and it set the standard for the Cold War that followed. It's important to consider what an achievement that was. It was not just a matter of not fighting wars. It was not as simple as some sort of middle way between, say, militarism and pacifism. It was about clearly understanding the implications of fighting those wars, what those implications would be, and about resisting those who failed to understand that. It was also about sizing up the needs and ambitions of the many participants in the struggle. There's not just two players in the effort to keep the peace. So he needed to ask questions like, would the Soviets risk everything to expand international communism? Did the Americans and Europeans have the same assessment of risk of Soviet attack? Were they prepared to sacrifice similarly in order to resist or roll it back? What were the implications of the divisions that emerged to the Eisenhower presidency between Beijing and Moscow? Those are not simple questions, and they're not managed in the style of a business deal. This is not about one party offering to sell something for $2 and the other party offering to buy it for $1 and settling on $1.50. These are genuinely multifaceted and complex problems. And by the way, the next time someone tells you the government should be run more like a business, keep that in mind too. It's not as simple as that. Eisenhower's determination to avoid communism while avoiding another war, or avoiding a war rather, a nuclear war, led him down another path. And in this case, it had ramifications that I would say he did not fully appreciate or consider. In 1953, Iran's government moved to liberalize some aspects of that society, and Eisenhower's advisors smelled the rat of Soviet meddling. A year later, the Arbenz government in Guatemala triggered the same reaction in Washington. Both times, Eisenhower resorted to covert action to respond. And both of those covert actions were successful, at least in the terms that Eisenhower set for them. In both cases, they succeeded in overthrowing those governments, toppling those governments, and replacing them with leadership that was more amenable to American influence. So in their day, they seemed to satisfy Ike's priorities. They kept the peace, and they contained Soviet or Chinese communism, in this case, Soviet communism. Measured against a larger backdrop, though, I think it's important to acknowledge and realize that they sowed difficulties for the United States that persist today, generations later, in the form of deep-seated animus and suspicion in much of Latin America, and certainly in Tehran. Some of the same might be said, by the way, in recent years about the American use of drones to satisfy military objectives in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, and elsewhere. As was mentioned nicely in the introduction, I worked with Leon Panetta on a book a few years ago, and this was very much something that we talked about in working on that book. Given the stakes and the complexity of all of these questions in foreign policy, there were tons of fateful moments and decisions that had to be made. My book about Eisenhower opens with one of those. It was a meeting of the National Security Council on May 1st of 1958. At that session, John Foster Dulles, who was Ike's Secretary of State, warned that the doctrine of massive retaliation, in his view, was kind of running its course, which was a striking thing because Dulles is really one of the architects of the idea of massive retaliation. Massive retaliation was the notion that if the Soviets encroached on Europe, the United States would use every nuclear weapon at its disposal to destroy the Soviet Union, and therefore the threat of that would deter Soviet interference. The problem with that is that by the late 1950s, some Europeans were questioning whether the United States would actually do that, whether the United States would launch a global nuclear war that would have almost certain implications for the United States in the form of retaliation in order to preserve Europe. And Dulles was worried that because the Europeans were losing confidence in it, that the Soviets would also begin to question whether the United States was willing to do that, and if doubt creeps into it, then the value of the deterrence declines. So Dulles proposed an alternative. This is what he said at the NSC meeting, I quote him: "The United States must be in a position to fight defensive wars which do not involve the total defeat of the enemy," end quote. That may sound kind of bland, but its implications are enormous. What Dulles was suggesting was that the United States should be prepared to fight a lower threshold nuclear war, a smaller conflict that might leave the Soviet Union standing. That is the opposite of the doctrine of massive retaliation. On the surface, there's some appeal. It might strengthen the value of deterrence. It might convince the Soviets and the Europeans that the United States was serious. But it also raised the likelihood of a war being fought by lowering the stakes of that war. Eisenhower's response was one that only Eisenhower could make. As he said during that meeting, he said, "A Soviet invasion of Europe would never produce," when I'm quoting him, what he called a nice, sweet World War II type war, which is a statement that pretty much only Eisenhower could make. It would instead result in the destruction of civilization as we knew it. Eisenhower believed, despite Dulles' warning, that only the threat of annihilation would keep the balance of power in Europe. So despite Dulles' arguments, Eisenhower stayed the course and stayed with the threat of retaliation and kept the peace. It's also, by the way, just a little aside here, it's worth noting that all of that, the entirety of what I just described to you, took place out of public view. If you look at the newspapers from the days after this meeting, there's no mention of the meeting. The meeting was not a matter of public record. The papers led with, there was the Soviets rejected an Eisenhower proposal to open the skies over the Arctic. That some newspapers led with that. There was a flood in Arkansas that got a lot of attention. There's several papers led with a story about Gary Cooper denying that he'd had recent plastic surgery, that he had a facelift. So some things don't change. But the point here is that when people often refer to the Eisenhower presidency as the hidden hand presidency, that's very much that idea at work there. This was monumental decision-making going on behind the scenes, and yet you would have no idea that any of that was taking place by living through it. Bottom line, Eisenhower used nuclear weapons to keep the Soviet Union in check, but he also negotiated with the Soviets and internally, sometimes boldly, to keep nuclear weapons in check. So that's the sort of interesting triangulation of it. Ike was the first American president to have the bomb and not use it, because Truman was the first American president to get it, and he used it. That set expectations for the balance of the Cold War, and of course they have never been used since. He threatened war, practiced peace. He warned the Soviets and the Chinese that he was prepared to lay waste to civilization to prevent the triumph of communism, but he repeatedly said no to those who wanted to actually do that. Before moving off foreign policy, let me just say one quick word, and we can talk about this more in questions if you all want to later, about how Eisenhower's example in this area has been emulated or ignored by some of his more recent successors. Just briefly, I mean, since the terrorist attacks on the United States on September 11th in 2001, almost 20 years ago, American foreign policy has been dominated by the resolve to prevent a recurrence of an event like that. That's what's come to be known as the War on Terror. That resolve led President Bush, who was, of course, it was on his watch that the attacks occurred, to send American forces first to Afghanistan and then to Iraq. His successor, Barack Obama, was one of the few members of the Senate who had opposed the war in Iraq, and he ran on an anti-war platform in Iraq. He substantially drew down forces there, but did not significantly draw down American forces in Afghanistan, and in fact stepped up the use of force in Afghanistan with the increased use of military drones, weaponized drones. Obama, of course, also famously concluded the decade-long hunt for the mastermind of 9/11, Osama bin Laden, who was killed in a Navy SEAL raid on May 2nd of 2011. As I alluded to earlier, to draw the comparison to Eisenhower, drones might be thought of as a form of covert action with all of the same advantages and potential long-term disadvantages that the covert actions of the Eisenhower years brought forward. Both Bush and Obama conducted their foreign policy in close consultation with American allies, particularly America's European allies. That's part of a tradition that dated to Eisenhower himself. President Trump, by contrast, ran on the slogan of America First. He disparaged the Europeans for failing, in his view, to carry their weight in the alliance, and he promised to bring American forces home. He definitely succeeded in antagonizing the Europeans. He was less successful in actually bringing forces home. That fell to his successor, President Biden, whose drawdown of American forces in Afghanistan is scheduled to be complete next month. They're on the precipice of finishing that now. Interestingly, I mean, I think at this point in his presidency, it's still very early, it's Biden who seems to most reflect the lessons of the Eisenhower in foreign policy. Bush and Obama both oversaw large deployments of Americans overseas, which Ike was loath to do. Trump's disparagement of the European alliance is something that surely would have appalled Eisenhower. At this point, it's Biden whose domestic and economic agendas are worlds apart from what Eisenhower. It's hard to imagine Eisenhower believed in balanced budgets, endorsing the Biden spending plans, but his foreign policy does actually look quite a bit like Eisenhower. So it's a sort of strange twist of history in that regard. Just to conclude on foreign policy, it is Ike's triangulation of American foreign and military policy through the Cold War, a middle way between war and peace. That it was sometimes bitter, it was often tense, it created deep unease about America's use of power. It came frighteningly close on several occasions to the destruction of Western civilization. But there is something else that's important to note about that period, which is that America won. And that served the world well. Eisenhower put America and the world on that course, and we are indebted to him for it. Indeed, we may all be alive to be here tonight because of it. The middle way in Eisenhower's hands was intended and often successful as a way of a course of safety through treacherous water, whether that's foreign or domestic. It's also, though, I think important to acknowledge that it had its limits. In matters of moral urgency, there sometimes is not a middle way, nor should there be. And the limits of Eisenhower's governing style were most apparent, I would argue, in his clumsier attempt to understand and lead in the area of civil rights. Again, a little background. Eisenhower grew up in segregated Abilene. He served most of his life in a segregated military. He was the first Republican, as I mentioned, to break the Democratic hold politically on the South, and he enjoyed his friendships with many prominent Southern leaders, many of whom were dedicated to the preservation of segregation. He was not exactly a racist, or at least no more a racist than most people, I think, of his era, but he was certainly a man of a particular time and position, and that placed limitations on his vision of what was possible in a multiracial society. He was also, in general, a gradualist. He was loath to have the government push its people around rather than the other way around. And as noted, he was, of course, inclined to look for areas of agreement, to pursue a middle way when he could find it. Those were strengths in some aspects of his presidency, and they were impediments as he confronted civil rights. Civil rights has different characteristics than the economy or the Cold War. And as he faced one controversy or one question after another in civil rights, he looked for ways to satisfy all sides and came to really resent the most forceful voices on either side of those arguments. He deplored what he called extremists on both sides. And that's a really unfortunate formulation, because it seems to equate, say, Martin Luther King with the men who bombed Martin Luther King's home, as if they were equally extremist in their views. It suggested that Ike didn't see a moral difference between young boys and girls who wanted to go to a neighborhood school and the snarling mobs of people who tried to keep them out of those schools. And there is, in fact, a moral difference between them. He seemed often unwilling or unable to settle on the right side of civil rights. He often addressed questions about civil rights vaguely. He sometimes seemed to vacillate about them. Yet, in one sense, he is responsible for some of the most important milestones in the 1950s on civil rights. He appointed Earl Warren to the United States Supreme Court as Chief Justice. Less than a year later, it was Warren who wrote the unanimous decision for the court in Brown versus Board of Education. Ike himself was conflicted about the ruling. The decision was announced on May 17, 1954. Eisenhower said nothing about it for 2 days. When he did address it at a press conference, this is what he said: "The Supreme Court has spoken, and I am sworn to uphold the constitutional processes in this country, and I will obey." That is not what you would call a ringing endorsement of that decision. And it set the tone for his subsequent handling of this issue. He seemed afraid to commit the prestige of his office or himself to the cause of integration. And that gave great comfort to those who sought to resist. It allowed them to believe that he might be with them in their resistance. Again, one curious aspect of this part of his presidency is that his record ends up being somewhat better than his instincts. And that's because of another aspect of his leadership, which was his determination, again learned in the military, his determination to delegate responsibility and decision-making to talented subordinates. In the case of civil rights, that meant often letting his Attorney General, the very gifted Herbert Brownell, chart the administration's policy, file its briefs, and actually select judges and judicial nominees. He gave Brownell wide latitude to find judicial nominees, even Supreme Court nominees. And Brownell, to the country's good luck, carried out those duties with exceptional skill. It was Ike himself who picked Earl Warren for the court, for the Chief Justiceship, although actually he offered it to Dulles first, and Dulles turned him down. But after that point, from that moment on, Brownell was the leading voice in every judicial nomination of the Ike presidency, as long as Brownell lasted. He and Ike gave the country such luminaries as Justices John Marshall Harlan and William Brennan Jr. And just as importantly, in the area of desegregation, tapped stalwart district and appellate court judges, such as John Minor Wisdom in Louisiana, Frank Johnson in Alabama, Albert Tuttle in Georgia, and John Brown here in Nebraska. It was the Warren Court, somewhat unfortunately, in what's known as Brown 2, allowed desegregation to move with what it called all deliberate speed. Given the vagueness of that language, it really fell to district and appellate court judges to interpret that language and to decide whether desegregation plans met the criteria of all deliberate speed. It was the judges picked by Eisenhower and Brownell, including the four I just named, who performed that role bravely and intelligently throughout the period. So again, while Eisenhower's instincts may not have been great on these issues, the people he selected to carry them out did, for the most part, a good job of it. His Supreme Court nominees, meanwhile, or appointees, rather, meanwhile, launched the civil rights era, the legal civil rights era, in Brown versus Board, and it was largely through the work of Warren and Brennan, another Eisenhower appointee, that the court delivered responded unanimously time and time again on issues of segregation. In the years that followed Brown versus Board, not one Eisenhower appointee ever dissented from a majority opinion on civil rights. At the same time, the struggle over civil rights tested Ike's patience. It did not always bring out the best in him. He fumed about Warren and the court. Incidentally, I'm going to have a session tomorrow about Ike and Warren, so I hope you'll join me for that. Eisenhower was frustrated with the court, although, interestingly, more often over what we would call civil liberties cases than civil rights cases. These are the cases that involve, for instance, members of the Communist Party or alleged members of the Communist Party and the right of government committees and to investigate communist affiliation. He, at one point in Ike's presidency, or in retirement, he and Warren ran into each other at an event, and Warren said, "I hear you're unhappy with the way we handled the communist cases. What would you have done with these communists?" And Ike's response was, "I'd kill the SOBs," which is not really a solution. But so anyway, you can see why they had differences of opinion, and again, we'll talk about that more tomorrow. But and yet, when the power of the presidency was most bluntly tested by the opponents of integration, Eisenhower held firm. The occasion for that test came in 1957, in the second Eisenhower term, and it was spurred by the intransigence of Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus. Faubus had interceded in the good faith efforts of the Little Rock School Board to begin the integration of that city's schools. The school board had proposed a plan that it hoped would meet the criteria of all deliberate speed, and Faubus interjected himself to prevent it from going forward. He was in a battle for re-election, and this was politics for Faubus. Instead, Faubus attempted to defy the United States Supreme Court and even some of his own constituents in Little Rock. Against Brownell's advice, Eisenhower at first met with Faubus and attempted to talk sense into him, but then when Faubus tried to squirm out of a commitment to allow black students to attend Little Rock High School under the protection of the National Guard, Eisenhower reacted with firm military might. He called up the 101st Airborne, which had served him well at Normandy, and ordered its soldiers to protect the black students and enforce the orders of the Supreme Court. Ike may have had misgivings about the court's work in this area, but he was not about to allow his authority to be undermined by some pipsqueak governor. It required force, and he was reluctant to use force, but force did prevail where persuasion had failed. In the field of civil rights overall, I would say that Eisenhower's instinct for a middle way was unhelpful. For the simple reason that there really is not a ready compromise between right and wrong. Eisenhower searched in vain for it, and in the end, he was forced to do what he had hoped to avoid, which was to exercise the full authority of his office in the form of a military engagement in the South. It worked, but it's also, I think, important to recognize that Ike's dawdling and equivocation up to that point may have given false hope and may have indirectly helped give rise to the confrontation that he was then forced to put down. But it's also important to note that the middle way, the limits of the middle way that are illustrated by Ike's struggles with civil rights, is that those were the exception, not the rule. Most problems in politics are not as morally unambiguous as civil rights. And solutions generally do not cleave so cleanly between right and wrong. They invite compromise and the search for progress. They command officials to make life better, not to throw in their towel at their inability to make it perfect. Eisenhower studiously sought and usually found that ennobling place in political debate, whether it was between his opinionated brothers in Abilene, the cranky Allied commanders in World War II, or the polarized forces of American politics in the 1950s. It is hard to argue with the results. After 8 years as president, Eisenhower could point to a period of peace and prosperity unrivaled in the history of the United States. Here, I'll just tick off for you in practice what it is that the middle way produced. During the 8 years of his administration, the American economy grew by roughly 40%. Americans in 1960 had 30% more purchasing power than they did in 1950. How many decades can you say that that was true in your lives? Income inequality shrank during the Eisenhower presidency, the last time in American history that an American presidency saw inequality shrink. Eisenhower inherited a $9.9 billion deficit in 1953. He left office with a $500 million surplus. He's the last president until Bill Clinton to actually leave the Treasury in the black. Millions of Americans shed their poverty in the 1950s. The rumblings of civil rights found their first expression in the Eisenhower years, and though they would not be fully realized in his presidency, the long march to equality lurched ahead as well. It was a period of extraordinary prosperity, transformative in the lives of countless American families. In the area of national defense, the results were even more striking. Within 7 months after taking office, Eisenhower brought the Korean War to an armistice. As part of the reason he was elected was that he was viewed as the person who was most likely to bring that conflict to a conclusion. From that point forward, over the next 8 years, China threatened and even shelled Taiwan. The Soviets threatened Berlin. The Viet Cong surrounded and captured the French garrison at Dien Bien Phu. The French, British, and Israelis invaded Egypt while deceiving the United States about their intentions. The Soviet Union invaded Hungary. Indonesia was torn by a civil war, so was the Congo. And of course, Castro came to power in Cuba. And yet, from the moment that Eisenhower ended the Korean War to the day that he turned the keys to the White House over to John Kennedy, the number of American servicemen killed in combat was 1. One American Marine was shot by a sniper in Lebanon. That's it. That's what happens when a skilled leader confronts a decade of peril with a real commitment to peace. It's easy to imagine today that we live in a singular period, that division is some kind of a new problem, although it's worth remembering that we did fight a civil war, so there's that. But it's easy to imagine now that we're past the point of being able to search for, much less reach a constructive center. Some people have just given up on the idea altogether, and some of those people are elected officials who really ought to know better. The lessons of the Eisenhower presidency suggest otherwise. Eisenhower confronted great and divisive forces in the 1950s. He confronted a nuclear menace and armed expansionist enemies. At home, his party was divided between staunch anti-communists and moderate backers of civil rights. The GOP of the 1950s stretched from Joe McCarthy to Earl Warren, each of whom presented Eisenhower with personal and political challenges. Ike did not manage all of that perfectly, but he was guided throughout by a conviction that he was responsible for doing what he could to make the nation better, and he did. Dwight Eisenhower left the United States freer, fairer, richer, and safer. That's the mark of a successful presidency. It's one I would argue that we would be wise to consider today. So with that, I thank you all for your time and attention. I look forward to taking your questions, and I guess, come on up, right? Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you. Do you have questions?
Whichever you prefer.
It doesn't matter.
Okay.
I think there's one here.
So I think we're going to have a mic kind of traveling around the audience, and I'll be calling on folks in the audience who want to ask questions of Jim. I'm happy to join in those conversations if anyone cares, but I think Jim is really our honored guest tonight, and I certainly have plenty of questions for him, but I think you guys do too. So I'll start just one while you guys are all gathering your thoughts and the mic is making its way over. I think we're all just sort of drawn to this talk that you gave tonight because of this central argument that you have about Eisenhower's ability to steer a centrist course, to express a conciliatory spirit in politics and in diplomacy. And we admire that, and we should, particularly in our own current political environment. But I'm also wondering, to what degree can we really ask our policymakers today to draw lessons from him? Because, as you said, well, we are not living in an unprecedented times. I'm wondering if, to some extent, we are trying to compare apples to oranges, right? Because Eisenhower's also operating in an era in which both the Democratic and Republican Party are quite centrist policies, right? The debates are about how much should we expand public housing, not should we get rid of it, right? People like Robert Taft, who want to do away with unions and steer an isolationist course, are really on the fringes, and elements that will sort of make up the emerging neoliberal turn in the 1960s haven't quite captured national spotlight yet. So what can we expect our current policymakers to sort of do in an Ike ilk, if you will, right? When we are talking about such a different environment.
Yeah, well, it's the obvious and important question, and I appreciate it. I don't want to overdraw it, and I think you're right to pull it back. The parties are very different. Among other things, both the Democratic and Republican parties were broader institutions than they are today. So that within the Republican Party of the 1950s, you had forces who supported desegregation, for instance, and forces that opposed it. Within the Democratic Party, you had liberal, northern, urban Democrats, and you had conservative, Dixiecrat, southern Democrats. So the parties were more divided internally and less coherent as a result, and therefore it made there was more room for maneuver, for compromise. At the same time, though, I guess my argument is that just because things have changed doesn't mean that we should give up on that notion. And that's, I think, really what I'm trying to call attention to, is to remind all of you, all of us, that it's been hard before. Certainly, it's probably never been harder than in the lead up to the Civil War. The notion that we are in a period where it's unresolvable, I think, is capitulation. I think that there are still common purposes. I think in a small way, you even see it around this infrastructure debate. There's general agreement in this country that there ought to be investment in infrastructure. There's a lot of disagreement about what is infrastructure. Does it include people or just projects? Does it include how big should it be? How should it be paid for? Those are legitimate sources of debate, but there is some coherent consensus in there too. And I think one of the things that division has habituated us to is to giving up and to saying that's just too big. Let's instead, tackle tiny issues that are not of great importance to most of our lives, and give up on the big ones. And there, I think, while it is difficult, and you're right to call attention to how difficult it is, it's worse to give up altogether. And I do think the Eisenhower years should remind us there was division then too, and it was overcomable under admittedly somewhat different circumstances.
During your talk tonight, I kept thinking of all these pundits who keep criticizing Biden that the spirit of compromise in D.C. doesn't exist the way that he thinks it does. And, your talk would give us some hope that maybe we can still hope for those sort of things.
One advantage of Biden being quite old is that he's been in government a long time, and he goes back far enough to have seen some of this. I do think it has changed, and sometimes he may be naive in imagining how far he can go, but I do credit him with at least being open to the possibility of that kind of government.
Okay, right in the far left here.
Thank you for a really informative talk. Could you talk at all about how Eisenhower's health had an impact on his ability to get his vision through?
Yes. Well, first, Eisenhower was the oldest man elected president when he was elected. His health was an issue throughout his presidency. He had a heart attack in the first term, a stroke in the second term, other ailments along the way. It certainly created, his heart attack created a real question about whether he would seek a second term. And that had, I'm not sure I can point to any specific policy that affected the debate around, but it certainly generally raised the question of whether the middle way was going to be on the table for 8 years or just 4. Of course, once he bounced back from that, he ran and ran quite easily. He ran against Stevenson again and beat him again. I don't know that I can point you to a specific policy that unfolded differently because of his health, but it certainly cast some question, particularly in the first term, about whether there would be a second term. And along with that, all the things that went with the second term, negotiations with the Soviet Union, what would the future of civil rights be like. Earl Warren, for instance, was lobbied to run for president in 1956 if Ike's health had not allowed it. If Ike's health had really faltered, I think he might have, with negative consequences, by the way, although I'm sort of a fan of Warren's. I think he probably did more good on the court than he could have done as president, and he might have lost the presidency, in which case we would have lost him in both capacities. So it did create that kind of uncertainty and questions about the future of the Eisenhower program and the approach. Most of those are most acute in the last year or so of the first term.
Question over here. Can you comment on his relationship with his vice president? His vice president never got mentioned in your speech.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and I probably should have mentioned him. It's complicated. Listen, it's very complicated because it's very hard to get a clean sense of that. Nixon very much felt that Eisenhower didn't like him and didn't ever welcome him. He never played golf with him. He used to complain constantly, like never let him to play around at golf. Nixon was so deeply insecure, though, that he was inclined to think that about other people. So there's that. Eisenhower certainly respected Nixon. He certainly appreciated the way Nixon handled his heart attack. Nixon ran the cabinet, but ran it with a real sense that Ike will return. He was not trying to take over. Eisenhower was very appreciative of it. And yet Eisenhower considered very seriously dropping Nixon from the ticket in 56. He actually suggested to Nixon that Nixon would be better suited to take over a department so that he would have experience running, say, the Department of Defense. Nixon smelled the trap in that and refused. Their relationship was sort of constantly one of miscommunication and insecurity and uncertainty, and yet wrapped in a kind of larger mutual appreciation. I mean, I think I did respect Nixon and tried to campaign for him in 1960. Did so badly. Nixon wasn't quite sure how to use Eisenhower in that campaign. Often a problem, by the way, with vice presidents trying to succeed a president. Gore had the same problem with Clinton. It's hard to know how to marshal them for political effect without being overshadowed by them. And one of the big issues in 1960 was that Kennedy claimed falsely this missile gap. And it was difficult to bring Eisenhower into that debate because Eisenhower knew that there wasn't a missile gap but felt constrained not to talk about it. And so that had its own set of uncertainties. There was a moment the reporters kept pressing Eisenhower in 1960 for an example of a decision that Nixon had helped him make so that it would show that Nixon was a valuable part of the White House. And Eisenhower, who could be quite stubborn and who did not like to be pressed on questions, resisted doing that because his argument was that he made the decisions and that he was responsible for them. The really unfortunate moment for Nixon came when Ike was pressed on this. A reporter said, "Give us an example," and he said, "Give me a week and I'll try to come up with one." And it was just like, ugh. I mean, you could just feel Nixon crumpling. Eisenhower apologized for it, tried to explain himself. The damage was done. Theirs was a very complex relation, and then of course complicated in addition by the fact that Nixon's daughter married Eisenhower's grandson. So the family relationships then are intertwined as well. Anyway, I wish I had a clean answer for you, but history does not provide one.
Right here.
Thank you. I can't remember the author's name, but he wrote an article in The Atlantic and has a book published. And the essence is that we don't have a national narrative anymore. I don't know if you've read this, but how important was it that during Eisenhower's time that there was one national narrative, or was there a national narrative that was more cohesive than maybe what we have today?
Well, I would defer to some of my fellow speakers on the question of whether there was, in fact, a national narrative. I don't know exactly how to answer that. I think there were certain points of national coherence, and fear of nuclear weapons, fear of the Soviet Union were certainly high among those. It did provide a kind of binding agent to American society. I also think some of the fractures that you see today just weren't present then. I mean, no one was really arguing that the New York Times was not a credible news organization in the 1950s. Whatever one thinks of its editorial positions, and I didn't particularly like them, there was not a serious debate about whether it was trying to whether it was fake, to use the term of art. So I think there were points of agreement that that were clarified, that some of which are much muddier today. One maybe poignant example of that is that the Salk vaccine for polio was rolled out in the 1950s. And there wasn't any serious debate about whether that was good for people. People took it, and polio largely went away. That's obviously not a luxury that we enjoy today. Is that the result of a common narrative? That's where I feel a little at sea.
I think it's a great question. I mean, I think it's why we're having, this gathering this weekend, and so many of the panels will be talking about it. I know one that I'm talking about tomorrow is this culture of consensus, and, we can talk about political consensus, economic, cultural. The tricky thing about national narratives, though, is that they're often created in a particular moment looking back upon the past, right? And so we have a narrative now about the 1950s as we and others, particularly politicians, look back to this golden age of the United States, and they craft mythic narratives. And I think that that's where narratives are more important to a sense of nationhood or people. And so if you're trying to pinpoint what that mythic narrative is in the 1950s, maybe we could talk about a sort of Wilsonian argument about the United States standing for the exportation of democracy, capitalism, and collective security across the world, because Americans had sort of cracked the recipes for success in all of these categories and thought that this was the way to ensure sort of the highest standard of living for people and globally and such. But that narrative in and of itself is flawed when we look at the 1950s domestically and internationally. So it's a great question, and not an easy one to answer either, and one that I think it would be useful to keep mulling on these next day and a half.
I agree with that.
Over here? Mm-hmm.
Got two more.
Sure.
It's kind of related. I was fascinated when you mentioned that many of the events of the 50s actually didn't appear, the political events did not appear in the press. Mm-hmm. And so that got me thinking, and I would like you to reflect on whether you thought the role that the press played vis-a-vis government was a factor in the success of the middle way for the most part, and then how do you think the role of the press vis-a-vis government has changed as of today, and what role might that be playing?
Yeah, well, those are big questions and good ones. Well, first of all, I think Eisenhower was determined to conceal from the American public certain aspects of his leadership. There's a famous moment where his aides were concerned. There was a delicate moment in the relationship with China and Taiwan, and he was about to give a press conference, and they were concerned he might say something to upset the apple cart in those negotiations. And he said, "Don't worry about it, I'll just confuse them." And he went out there and he just sort of gibberish and just sort of spouted things. No one could really make sense of what he was saying, and that was intentional. And at the time, it was sort of regarded as evidence that he really just wasn't facile verbally. In fact, sometimes that was true, but sometimes he was quite skillful in using. So I don't really know what responsibility to assign to the press in that. That's a strategic decision on his part, for better and for worse. I mean, I think it yielded some positive results. Probably was useful in his handling of foreign affairs in certain respects. Maybe less so in areas like civil rights, where a more open presentation might have been more successful. As to the press generally, clearly the press is more inquisitive and more aggressive today than it was in the Eisenhower years. I started my career working for James Reston, whose work at the New York Times dates back to the Eisenhower years, so we sort of were a bridge to that period. And he was one of the things he impressed upon me as a very young journalist was a certain deference to people, a certain recognition that people have lives and concerns and troubles that are really not the business of the press. That's an idea honored in the breach today. You know? And so I would say the press has changed. In some sense, the press has responded to government that has often proved itself not to be trustworthy, and the press therefore places less trust in it. I do think there's a point where skepticism can become hostility, and that's not useful. And I think the Trump years, I mean, call people the enemy of the people often enough and they'll start to get irritated about it. And so I think the Trump years clearly exacerbated that. But there's a natural tension there, and some of it's useful, and sometimes it goes too far. And I think we are at risk of it going too far today, and it's hard to pull that back. Once you've lied to people, it's hard for them to take you seriously from that point forward, and that's kind of where we are in that culture.
I'd love to jump in here and piggyback on this excellent question and give Jim the opportunity to talk a little bit about the role of the international press in the Eisenhower years. I think you're absolutely right that much of what happened in 1957 is this conflict between Eisenhower and Faubus and the vision of the federal government versus state governments and the power of the presidency. But Eisenhower also intervenes to a great extent in Arkansas in 1957 because he cares what the newspapers in India are saying. Right? So if you could talk about that a little bit.
Excellent point. I mean, one of the things Eisenhower is very concerned with is America's image abroad, as reflected in the press and as reflected in reports back from embassies. The notion that what Faubus was doing was emboldening and encouraging the Soviet Union weighed very heavily on him. And in fact, the cable traffic from American embassies during the Little Rock standoff, a lot of it is about the way the United States is being portrayed in the foreign press and what that does to what an opportunity that provides for the Soviet Union. So that prism was very much one of concern for the Eisenhower administration.
We have one last question over here.
You know, as I recall, Eisenhower was extremely popular, you know, coming back from Europe. He was a hero, and he had $1 million smile, and that gave him a step up in terms of the presidency, that he could take that middle ground and be forgiven, that a lot of other people just did not have that prestige at that time, and there aren't too many people on the national scene that do.
I like Ike.
I like Ike was a big thing, and everybody did.
And what did the other party say? I like him too.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. And he was aware of that. You know, there is a tendency on presidents, not just Ike, but to protect the approval rating at all costs and to avoid conflicts that might whittle away at it. I think he was secure in himself and in his own achievements that he was willing to leverage his popularity in a way, partly because he had the luxury of being very popular, but also, you know, when Eisenhower retired from the presidency, we were talking about this earlier outside of this meeting, but he reverted to being referred to as general. He wanted to be. He used to say, "I spent my whole life to become a general. I just became president by accident." And so, in an odd way, the presidency, I think, mattered less to him than it does to almost maybe every other American president. And that's a luxury too, to be able to use that popularity to achieve things without such an abiding fear that a point or two is a fatal blow. So I think he both had that popularity, was aware of that popularity, and was willing to leverage that popularity.
Please help me thank Dr. Danielle Battisti and Jim Newton. Thank you.
Pleasure.